This is Joe Bakhmoutski, and welcome to Power to Be Happy. This show, we talk about healing from trauma and living a greater life. And today, I'm super excited to have Jason Carbone from Wayne State University, who is an expert on stress and allostatic load, amongst other things. And allostatic load being the cumulative wear and tear of just long-term exposure to stress on pretty much all parts of our body, of our systems, and really also understanding how that impact of chronic stress impacts us as individuals, but also the broader community, and how does that all fit in together. So, welcome, Jason.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me. Good to be here. Excited about this.
Awesome. Well, Jason, when I first heard about the allostatic load, I kind of like felt this weight almost like lifted off of my shoulders because I realized like, this is why my life is the way that it is, and I guess I didn't connect the impact of trauma and stress on health and all these different aspects of our lives. So why is it important for us, Jason, to kind of see the impact of stress, to see it for what it is, and to also just to kind of understand how it works and how it impacts ourselves.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's important because it has that impact on our health, our well-being, and just our everyday lives, right? A lot of people think about stress, and we use the word kind of colloquially a lot as, oh, I'm stressed, but without oftentimes really thinking about what that means and the biological, the physical impacts and that actually has. And I mean, I don't think you need me here. You explained it really well in terms of what the concept is. But I think that the key aspect of allostatic load is its cumulative wear and tear. Cumulative being the key, right? That it is how long-term exposure to chronic stress builds in us physically and can change our biology and change how we can change our well-being and modify um, kind of our health outcomes as a result of that cumulative long-term stress.
Jason, maybe it's just me, but it seems like this is something that hasn't gotten a lot or as much attention as it should. Is it just me, or why does it seem to be the case?
I don't know. It's hard for me to say being kind of right now in academia. Academia is kind of odd in lots of different ways, but a lot of times you have people who are very specialized in areas and they know a lot about those areas and they know the people who work in those areas. But it takes a lot to get that knowledge sometimes out into the general public in a way that's meaningful. And I think in some ways that's where it is. Now, I did with some colleagues did a review of the literature of kind of the allostatic load use in literature. And what you've seen is in the past, well, where are we now? What year? 25, 30 years, there's been a drastic increase in it. And the whole concept of it dates back to the early 90s. So generally speaking, allostatic load as kind of thought about today isn't all that old, right? Where the concept of stress is a lot much older. So, and in some sense, it's because it's kind of new. And some senses, I think it's just it hasn't really gotten to the place where a lot of people kind of apply it. And that's the other part of the issue, right? And that's what I try to do a little bit in my work is, okay, academically, yeah, we understand this and we understand this in lab settings or, and that, but what does this mean for everyday people or people in their everyday lives? And that, translation is happening, I think, but that's still very new, and there are lots of challenges around that, and we can talk about some of those. But yeah, it hasn't spread as much as you think maybe it should, or at least as much as I think it should, right? Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And hopefully the whole translation thing is gonna be ramping up as well, because we really want to see so much more of that translating it into our everyday life so that we can do something about it. So what makes it kind of go up or down in life, and And I guess how do we think about reducing the allostatic load once it builds up?
Yeah, it's hard because in some ways allostatic load is always going to build. It's a matter of what that curve looks like. And what I mean by that is you can argue that the natural process of aging, right, just will increase your allostatic load on some level. But is it increasing at this rate or is it increasing at that rate, right? In terms of what that looks like and the biological effects. So again, kind of taking a step back for a second. So, one of the challenges with allostatic load, or we call it sometimes called AL for short, is, in my opinion, theory-wise, it's a very elegant theory. But in terms of how that translates into practice, operationalizing, that can be challenging in terms of measuring it and that sort of thing. So that's where some of the challenges with the idea, and there's still researchers still trying to develop really what that really looks like, which um, kind of goes back to your question of how do you change it? Well, it depends on how you define it, like the specifics of how you define it, right? But thinking about how do we basically that the short answer is how do you manage your stress? And theoretically, if you're able to better manage your stress, you're better able to cope with that, then you'll have your AL will decrease a little. But again, it's a long-term measure, a measure of chronic exposure to stress. So it's not something you do, for a few weeks and all of a sudden see a change in your biology, right? It's about what happens over time. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of measuring, like how do we measure allostatic load?
yeah, that's challenging. So again, thinking back to this definition, like you said, the cumulative wear and tear. So even in the short time that this concept has been around, it's evolved in terms of how we measure it and how we operationalize it with the definition of what that looks like. But basically, in research studies, um, it's measured through a series of biomarkers. So you think, if you're like, well, what's a biomarker? Well, the different biological systems have different biomarkers. So you can think of, people often think of cortisol as a stress hormone, but there are lots of others, right? Even norepinephrine, epinephrine, sometimes dopamine could be in there. And then you have your other biological systems, right? Your metabolic system, glucose metabolism, lipid metabolism, like cholesterol, that sort of thing, heart rate, blood pressure, and immune system. That's another big one, is what are the immune markers that contribute to allostatic load. And really the idea of allostatic load is it's not one piece or one, it's this, again, cumulative effect. So you look at these biomarkers across the entire body and see if they're kind of on average out of the normal range or out of the range of what like is considered healthy. And that can be challenging because it can be intensive in terms of measuring that, right? Doing blood work, urine sample analysis, that sort of thing. So it's not, unfortunately, it's not something that you just do at home or that you can kind of track on your own or track with your Fitbit or something like that, right? Using the true allostatic load definition, right? It's much more involved. And that's, again, but that's part of the piece of the puzzle where I think, going back to your previous comment about it not being translated necessarily into everyday use, part of that's part of the problem, because you can't necessarily measure your own AL, but it's more of a way to think about how stress is impacting you long term. Yeah.
So absolutely, Jason. So how does having, a high allostatic load impact our ability to deal with more stress and uncertainty that come to us with the inevitable challenges of day-to-day life?
Yeah. So part of it is thinking about what does that stress response look like? So a lot of the research focuses on um, kind of think about well, let me back up for a second. So you think about in a just an everyday stressor. So for example, a lot of people have stage fright. So going up on stage, what happens when you're exposed to some sort of stressful event? You start to breathe heavy, your heart, you get a little, maybe um, your hormones kind of release, you can't get a little amped up and ready to go, right? And the idea is that once that stressor is over, for example, if you're doing a performance, once that performance is over, you return to your baseline level, right? Your body goes back to homeostasis, its baseline state. So what allostatic load theory says is chronic exposure to stress changes that baseline, right?
Ah.
And a lot of the work currently focuses on kind of elevating that baseline, kind of being in that hyper aroused state, right? So this idea that you're always in this hyper aroused state. And that's why some of this work is kind of aligns well with research on anxiety or PTSD, right?
Mhm.
Because you could argue that the same biological functions are happening. But that's just one piece of it, right? There are other stress responses that you can have, not just hyperarousal. Another example of that is kind of a hypoarousal. Most people, have heard the term learned helplessness, right? That's arguably a chronic, an allostatic load response where your body, over chronic exposure to stress, it kind of shuts down and then it doesn't react so that you're so kind of just desensitized to the stressors that when you're exposed to that stressor, you don't react. Your body doesn't react, right? When you're going back to that stage fright example, when you go up on stage, your body doesn't have a stress response at all because it's desensitized, right? So those are kind of some of the different profiles, and you need to, again, that's where our limitation of the research is now, is we haven't explored what all those really mean. But those are the profiles. And then thinking back, I'm kind of losing track of of your original question. But you were asking about how we get back to normal, right? Or how we, so part of it is, what is your stress response, and then how, what is it, that hypo? Is it hypo? But how do we try to get our biological response to return to a baseline that is healthy, and that can be challenging. And I don't think there's a true answer to that yet, but there still needs to be more work in that space. Is looking at that.
I just love the idea of a baseline and the baseline changing because like I think it's a helpful way to think about it because I feel like particularly in your example about using like this constantly elevated state where this might be due to anxiety or might be due to PTSD, and and everything is like just seems or feels so much bigger than it probably should, right? And also the other baseline that you're talking about where you kind of don't even respond to things anymore in a way that
Hmm.
again you really should. And I guess all of that comes from the brain, right? So tell me, Jason, what role does the brain have in all of this, in this dealing with stress, and what happens when it comes up?
Yeah, I think that's really important to think about because I would say it kind of falls into two different categories, right? One is the stress response, so triggering, right? Your brain is what starts this cascading effect of biological changes in terms of that immediate stress response. And then over time, again, that can become chronic. So um, again, thinking about changes in norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine, and then triggering other hormones, uh, cortisol, and then DHEAS, and so on and so forth. So there's that piece of it. But then there's this other piece that we don't always think about, and that is the cognitive aspect of it. So some of my work focuses on neighborhood perceptions and allostatic load, particularly around mental health. But this idea of recognizing that there's a perception piece of it in terms of how we perceive a stressor. So the neighborhood example is a good one because based on previous experiences, previous environments, your perception of safety in a neighborhood may be different than your neighbors, even though you're in the same neighborhood. right? And a lot of times this happens, this isn't even conscious sometimes. A lot of this is subconscious. But that cognitive process is key. Another example that there's some research around that is, I think, is interesting is, spousal relationships. Your spousal relationship, on one hand, it could be a stressor, right? On the other hand, it can be a buffer to other stressors. In other words, it can help you cope with other stressors. And in reality, for most people, it's both, right? There are times where it can be a stress, and sometimes where it is your buffer and helps you cope with those stress. But why is that? Well, it's based on the relationship, it's based on the history, it's based on your cognitive perception, right? So there's this pre-processing cognitive piece. And again, a lot of it isn't even necessarily conscious, but that piece does happen in the brain that then will either trigger or not trigger that the rest of the process that could exacerbate or lead to allostatic load.
Cool. So that's awesome because I love the idea of cognitive perception. And, and it's also scary that, sometimes like it just happens completely unconsciously. So does this mean, Jason, that we want to try and elevate like our stresses and I guess the way that we deal with things to a more conscious level so that we can then kind of deal with it better? Is that how it works?
I think that's a piece of the puzzle. Yeah. Yeah. The awareness of it. And I know for me personally, I know sometimes it happens. It's like where you're not aware, right? You feel it, right? And then, you feel the stress and then you need to step back and say, wait a second, why am I where's this coming from? What is
Mhm.
the true stressor behind this? I think a lot of people fall into that bucket where oh, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine, but they're really not. And being able to step back and say, okay, what is really happening here? How do I really feel? And then how does that lead, how does that relate to these stressors that I'm experiencing or not experiencing? But yeah, and again, I think there's more to it than that because again, the process that response to stress, like I said, it's subconscious and it happens so quick. So sometimes, it you cannot necessarily in the moment cognitively say, okay, even if you do say, hey, I understand this is a stressful situation. I understand what's happening. Cognitively, you could get it, so to speak, but your body is responding, your body is reacting, and you can't stop that once that starts. So, that's where for example, trauma and exposure and history of trauma, that's where that comes in, right? Even in the moment, you may say, okay, yes, I know I'm not in danger right now, but your body is saying, no, you're in danger because of that history that you've experienced that in the past. So that's where it's tricky. So I don't want to kind of give the impression that, oh, it's all in your control, and if you just think or try hard enough, you can stop it, because that's not true. It's a process, and that's it. And the cognitive aspect is a piece of it, but it's much more complicated and deeper rooted than that.
100%. So, and if we look at something like, PTSD, and, doing and having therapy that might be supportive, right? There's different therapies that might be super helpful when it comes to dealing with PTSD. Um, so if someone is, for example, doing therapy that is supportive for them, does this mean that over time, this potentially changes that baseline and hopefully lowers it and helps the person just to not only manage their chronic stress, but also deal with the stresses that happen in kind of day-to-day life better?
That's a really, really good question, and I don't know. I would say you'd think so, yes. I think part of the challenges, this is where kind of the research is limited, is there's been some research around allostatic load and PTSD, and they're in a lot of ways, similar in some of the biological things that happen. The question is, are they parallel processes, or is one causing the other, right? Is there a causal relationship, or is it correlational and there's something else, right? So I'd like to answer your question with say, yes, absolutely, definitely. That's what I think, right? You would think, but the science doesn't necessarily back that up yet. But that's again an area that needs to be further explored. Is really what is that? Is it truly causational, or is it just correlational, and the same thing is happening in two different ways, and we need to better understand that, and maybe there's a third variable kind of at work there. So I can't say for sure. I don't think anyone can say for sure at this point, but I conceptually, I think where what you're saying, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, fantastic, Jason. So, when you say that there is two things happening at the same time, that there is like a causal relationship, does this mean that, you know, that there is, events that happen, but also, that those two things are related, but they kind of bounce off each other? How does it work?
Yeah, so I guess what I mean is, there are specifically, we'll take the PTSD example, right? There are biological changes that occur, that changes in some biomarkers that are markers of PTSD. And here's the other complicated aspect of this: is it's not always the case, but in certain situations, right? So you can look at that and say, wow, that pattern of change is similar to what you would see in elevated allostatic load, right? So if you overlay those two look similar, so they must be the same. Well, you can't say, so that you'd want to say, oh, well, allostatic load that explains PTSD. That's that connection, but you can't necessarily say that. So, it just the biological changes that happen again are similar, and there needs to be more work to explore that. But yeah, so that's where you can't make a causal relationship, but there seems to be something there, and it makes a lot of sense that there's a lot of overlap. So then the question becomes, okay, what does that really look like? And if you address one, will it help treat the other? Yeah, but it's still like we said earlier, it's still actually a fairly emerging area, and there needs to be some additional work there.
Totally, Jason. So we talked about the cognitive response, right? Is how that's plays is a true part of kind of how do we think about stress ourselves. But there's also the response, right? So with the response of like, how do we respond better to everyday stress, things that come up in our life? Or also how do we respond on one hand to everyday stress, but on the other hand to maybe incredibly stressful events that might be traumatic events. So how can we kind of respond to it in a more helpful way, I guess is what I want to ask you.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think there's no one answer fits all. It kind of depends on the situation, depends on the individual, but there are tools out there. One of the kind of common ones that has some evidence behind it is kind of more mindfulness approaches, mindfulness-based interventions, therapies, that sort of thing, to make folks more aware of those things and um, try to address them. There are things you can do to basically. I think that the answer, well, or the approach is to address that kind of more immediate stress. I think we need to kind of separate these two kind of major stressful events in one bucket, and then kind of the everyday stressors in the other, because they'll obviously need two different approaches. But in terms of like the everyday stressors, those are the things that can really accumulate over time and really kind of fit the allostatic load model. And those are the things that you could arguably have more control over, trying to address, manage, uh, in order to bring your everyday stress level down, which ideally would lower your allostatic load over the long term, or at least slow it.
Absolutely. So Jason, like what are some of the more, I guess, then immediate ways to um like make us help feel better in everyday life, uh, given that there's things that come up and throw us off and that might be challenging.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just those things you hear about all the time that we always kind of forget to do, right? Just like I mentioned, some mindfulness, getting out, fresh air, exercise, healthy eating, sleep is a big thing, right? I do some work around kind of understanding the role of sleep and mental health, and that plays in here too as well. So, um, and again, my field of practice is social work, and we talk a lot about self-care in social work, although oftentimes we don't do a very good job of it, but all those things kind of fall under that self-care. And so it's hard sometimes to make sure that you're doing that and doing that well. It's hard to find time to do that. It's hard to find the energy sometimes to do that. But those self-care things are, I think, kind of a big piece of that puzzle of how to address that and deal with those day-to-day stressors.
Yeah, makes perfect sense, Jason. And just lastly, I want to touch on the connection between the stress we experience as individuals and also kind of how that connects to broader the community and our society at large. How does it all kind of fit together from the allostatic load perspective?
Yeah, that it's a two-way relationship, I think you could argue. So one is, how does kind of community stress impact you, right? How do you take that in? How do you absorb that? And then how does that impact you? And then just, that community level stress, a lot of times you could think about that as just um, the sum total of everyone's stress, right? So there's not a lot of work, I think, in that space that there's an increasing focus, I think, in the research on this topic of community level stressors, and community level experiences. So, one example of this is a lot of people have heard of ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, um, that can result from trauma and negative exposures. But there's a growth and a recognition of adverse community level experiences,
Wow.
and recognizing that things that happen in the community, they impact us individually and trickle down, whether that's community violence or even things such as economic stresses that happen in communities when plants and businesses shut down, lay people off, right? So these are other types of community level stressors that impact individuals. So, um, again, another area that's growing in research. There needs to be more work done in that area, I think, and that's an area I find very interesting. But yeah, I mean, those things impact individuals. Those stressors trickle down and impact individuals. And then also thinking about how, again, the reverse of that relationship. How do people then um, try to change the community or benefit or strengthen the community or come together, coalesce to try to address these adversities, these community level adversities. And doing so could be a good intervention, a good way to address that community level stress, right? Because if you can work together to ameliorate that community level stress, then that benefits individuals too, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, Jason. Well, thank you so much for sharing your perspective on allostatic load and doing the research in this space, amongst all the other wonderful things that you're doing. Thank you so much for being here, Jason, and sharing your perspective on how we can deal with chronic stress better.
Right. Thank you for having me.